bottles of each brand are in the background. We don't ask about the packages, but they are there. And what happens? Now we get a statistical preference for E&J. So we've been able to isolate what Christian Brothers' problem is. The problem is not the product, and it's not the branding. It's the package. Ria pulled out a picture of the two brandy bottles as they appeared in those days. Christian Brothers looked like a belay of wine. It had a long, slender spout and a simple white label. E&J, by contrast, had a far more ornate, more squat, like a decanter with smoked glass, foil jing around the spout, and a dark, richly textured to prove their point. Ria and his colleagues did musist. They served 200 people Christian Brothers brandy out of an E&J bottle, and E&J brandy Christian Brothers hands down by the biggest margin out of a Christian Brothers bottle. Which brandy won? Oh, now they had the right taste, the right brand, and the right bottle. The company redesigned their bottle to be a lot more like NJ's, and sure enough, their problem was solved. Cheskin's offices are just outside San Francisco, and after we talked, Masson and Ria took me to a Nob Hill Farm supermarket down the street, one of those shiny, cavernous food emporia that populate the American suburbs. We've done work in just about every aisle, Masson said as we walked in. In front of us was the beverage section. Ria leaned over and picked up a can of 7-Up. We tested 7-Up. We had several versions, and what we found was that if you add 15% more yellow to the green on the package, if you take this green and add more yellow, what people report is that the taste experience has a lot more lime or lemon flavor. And people were upset. You are changing my 7-Up. Don't do a new Coke on me. It's exactly the same product, but a different set of sensations have been transferred from the bottle, which in this case isn't necessarily a good thing. From the cold beverage section, we wandered to the canned goods aisle. Maston picked up a can of Chef Boyardee ravioli and pointed at the picture of the chef on the label of the can. His name is Hector. We know a lot about people like this, like Orville Redenbacher or Betty Crocker or the woman on the Sun-Made Raisins package. The general rule is the closer consumers get to the food itself, the more consumers are going to be concerned. And what that means for Hector is that in this case, he may look pretty literal. You want to have the face as a replicable human being that you can relate to. Typically, C-ups of the face work better than full body shots. We test Hector in a number of different ways. Can you make the ravioli taste better by changing him? Mostly you can blow it, like by making him a cartoon figure. We looked at him in the context of photography down to cartoon karate kinds of things. The more you go to cartoon characters, the more of an abstraction Hector becomes, the less and less effective you are in perceptions of the taste and quality of the ravioli. And Maston picked up a can of Hormel canned meat. We did this too. We tested the Hormel logo. He pointed at the tiny sprig of parsley between the R and the M. That little bit of parsley helps bring freshness to canned food. Ria held out a bottle of Classico tomato sauce and talked about the meanings attached to various kinds of containers. When Del Monte took the peaches out of the tin and put them in a glass container, people said, this is something like my grandmother used to make. People say peaches taste better when they come in a glass jar. It's just like ice cream in a cylindrical container as opposed to a rectangular package. People expect it's going to taste better, and they are willing to pay 5-10 cents more just on the strength of that package. What Maston and Ria do is tell companies how to manipulate our first impressions, and it's hard not to feel a certain uneasiness about their efforts. If you double the size of the chips in chocolate chip ice cream package, new, bigger chocolate chips, and to 10 cents more, that seems honest and fair. Put your ice cream in a round as opposed to a container and charge 5 to 10 cents more, that you're pulling the wool over people's eyes. If about it, though, there really isn't any practical between those two things. We are willing to pay ice cream when it tastes better, and putting iced tea around a container convinces us it tastes better just as making the chips bigger in chocolate chip does. Sure, we're conscious of one improvement, conscious of the other. But why should that D matter? Why should an ice cream company be profit only from improvements that we are cons? You might say, well, they're going behind our BA who's going behind our back, the ice cream CO or our own unconscious. Neither Maston nor Ria believes that clever engine allows a company to put out a bad-tasting product taste if the product itself matters a great deal. They're simply that when we put something in our mouth at the blink of an eye, decide whether it tastes good, or are reacting not only to the evidence from our TAs and salivary glands, but also to the evidence of our e-memories and imaginations. And it is foolish of a CEO to service one dimension and ignore the other. In that context, then, Coca-Cola's error with Coke becomes all the more egregious. It wasn't Jew they placed too much emphasis on sip tests. It was TH. Entire principle of a blind taste test was ridiculous. They shouldn't have cared so much that they were losing blind taste tests with all Coke, and we shouldn't at all be surprised that Pepsi's dominance in blind taste tests never translated to much in the real world. Why not? Because in the real world, no one ever drinks Coca-Cola blind. We transfer to our sensation of the Coca-Cola taste all of the unconscious associations we have with the brand, the image, the can, and even the unmistakable red of the logo. The mistake Coca-Cola made, Ria says, was in attributing their loss in share to Pepsi entirely to the product. But what counts for an awful lot in clothes is the brand imagery, and they lost sight of that. All their decisions were made on changing the product itself, while Pepsi was focusing on youth and making Michael Jackson their spokesman and doing a lot of good branding things. Sure, people like a sweeter product in a sip test, but people don't make their product decisions on sip tests. Coke's problem is that the guys in white lab coats took over. Did the guys in the white lab coats take over in Kenneth's case as well? The market testers assumed that they could simply play one of his songs or part of one of his songs for someone over the telephone or on the internet, and the responsive listeners would serve as a reliable guide to what music buyers would feel about the song. Their music lovers can thin slice a new song in a matter of seconds, and there is nothing wrong with that idea in principle. But thin slicing has to be done in context. It is possible to quickly diagnose the health of a marriage, but you can't just watch a couple playing ping pong. You have to observe them while they are discuss something of relevance to their relationship. It's POS to thin slice a surgeon's risk of being sued for malpractice on the basis of a small snippet of conversation. But I to be a conversation with a patient. All of the people warm to Kenna had that kind of context. The Peep, the Roxy, and the No Doubt concert saw him in the FL. Craig Callman had Kenna sing for him, right there in office. Fred Durst heard Kenna through the prism of his trusted colleague's excitement. The viewers of M, who requested Kenna over and over, had seen his vid judging Kenna without that additional information, is making people choose between Pepsi and Coke in a BLI taste test. 4. The Chair of Death. The Aeron chair was the brainchild of two well-known industrial designers, Don Chadwick and Bill Stumpf. T2 had been hired by furniture maker Herman Miller, with whom they had worked before, most notably O-chairs called the Ergon and the Equine. Yet they weren't entirely satisfied with their earlier efforts. Both had sold. Well thought that the Ergon was clumsy, immature effort. The Echo was better, but it had since been copied by so many other firms that it no longer seemed special. The chairs we had done previously all looked alike, Stumpf says. The Aeron was a deliberate attempt to come up with something that looked different. But the two men A, the most ergonomically correct chair imaginable. They Stumpf and Chadwick's first idea was to try to had done that to some extent with the Echo, but with the Aeron they went even further. An enormous amount of work, for instance, went into the mechanism connecting the back of the chair to what chair designers call the seat, the two, so you can lean back in the chair. But the problem came. In a typical chair, there is a simple hinge connecting with the hinge, is that the chair pivots in a different way from how our hips pivot, so tilting pulls the shirt out of our pants and puts undue stress on our back. On the Aeron, the seat pan and back of the chair moved independently through a complex mechanism. And there, well, much more. The design team at Herman Miller wanted fully adjustable arms, and that was easier if the arms of the chair were attached to the back of the Aeron, not underneath the seat pan, as is ordinarily the case. They wanted to maximize support from the shoulders, so the back of the chair was wider at the top than at the bottom. This was exactly the opposite of most chairs, which are wide at the boom and tapered at the top. Finally, they wanted the chair to be comfortable for people who were stuck at their desks for long periods of time. I looked at straw hats and other things, like wicker furniture, Stumpf says. I've always hated from chairs covered in fabric, because they seem hot and sticky. The skin is an organ, it breathes. This idea of getting something breathable like the straw he was in training some. What they settled on was a speakily engineered with this elastic mesh stretched tight over the plastic but closely through the mesh sheet. You could see the levers and mechanisms and hard plastic appendages in plain sight below the seat pan. In Herman Miller's years of working with consumers on seating, they had found that when it came to choosing office chairs, most people automatically gravitated toward the chair with the most presumed status, something senatorial or throne-like, with thick cushions and a high, imposing back. What was the Aeron? It was the exact opposite, a slender, transparent concoction of black plastic and odd protuberances and mesh that looked like the exoskeleton of a giant prehistoric insect. Comfort in America is very much conditioned by lazy boy recliners, says Stumpf. In Germany, they joke about Americans wanting too much padding in their car seats. We have this fixation on softness. I always think of that glove that Disney put on Mickey Mouse's hand. If we saw his real claw, no one would have liked him. What we were doing was running counter to that idea of softness. In May of, Herman Miller started doing what they call use testing. They took prototypes of the Aeron to local companies in western Michigan and had people sit in them for at least half a day. In the beginning, the response was not positive. Herman Miller asked people to rate the chair's comfort on a scale of 2 is perfect, and at least 7.5 is where you'd really love to be before you actually go to market. And the early prototypes of the Aeron came in at around 4.75. As a gag, one of the Herman Miller staffers put a picture of the chair on the mock-up cover of a supermarket tabloid with the headline, "Chair of Death, everyone who sits in it dies in Maid." If the cover of one of the early Aeron research people would look at the wiry frame and wonder what hold them, and then look at the mesh and wonder it could ever be comfortable. It's very hard to get somebody to sit on something that doesn't look right, Rob Harvey, who was Herman Miller's senior vice president of research and design at the time. If you build a chair that has a wiry frame, people's perception is that isn't going to hold them. They get very tentative about eating in it. Seating is a very intimate kind of thing. The body comes intimately into contact with the chair, so there are a lot of visual cues like perceived temperature and hardness that drive people's perceptions. But as Herman Miller tinkered with the design, coming up with new and better prototypes, and got people to overcome their qualms, the scores began to inch up. By the time Herman Miller was ready to go to market, the comfort scores were in fact above 8. That was the good news. The bad news? Just about everyone thought the chair was a monstrosity. From the beginning, the aesthetic scores lagged way behind the comfort scores, said Bill Dell, who was research lead on the Aeron. This was an anomaly. We've tested thousands and thousands of people sitting in chairs, and one of the strongest correlations we've always found is between comfort and aesthetics. But here it didn't happen. The comfort scores got above 8%, which is phenomenal. But the aesthetic scores started out between 2 and 3, and never got above 6 in any of our prototypes. We were quite perplexed, and not unworried. We'd had the Echo chair. That chair was controversial, too. It was always seen as beautiful. This time the reception was downright chilly. They didn't understand the aesthetic at all, says Dowell. Herman Miller started to cover the Aeron with solid fabric, would be impossible to sell it to corporate clients. One facility manager likened the chair to lawn furniture or old-fashioned car seat covers. Another said it looked as though it came from the set of RoboCop, and another said that it looked as if it had been made entirely from recycled materials. I remember one professor at Stanford who confirmed the concept and its function, but said he wanted to be invited back when we got to an aesthetically refined prototype, Dahl remembers. We were behind the glass saying, there isn't going to be an aesthetically refined prototype. In late, as they prepared to launch the chair, Herman Miller put together a series of focus groups around the country. They wanted to get some ideas about pricing and marketing, and make sure there was general support for the concept. They started with panels of architects and designers, and they were generally receptive. They understood how radical the chair was, Dow said. Even if they didn't see it as a thing of beauty, they understood that it had to look the way it did. Then they presented the chair to groups of facility managers and ergonomic experts, the kinds of people who would ultimately be responsible for making the chair a commercial success. Put yourself for a moment in Herman Miller's shoes. You have committed yourself to a brand new product. You have spent an enormous amount of money retooling your furniture factory, and still more making sure that, say, the mesh on the Aeron doesn't pinch the behinds of people who sit in it. But now you find out that people don't like the mesh. In fact, they think the whole chair is ugly. And if there's one thing you know from years and years in the business, it is that people don't buy chairs they think are ugly. That's what you do. You could scrap the chair entirely. You could go back and cover it in a nice familiar layer of foam, or you could trust your instincts and dive ahead. Not much Herman Miller took the third course. They went ahead, and what happened? In the beginning, the Aeron, after all, was ugly. Before long, however, the chair started to attract the attention of some of the very cutting-edge elements of the design community. It won a Design of the Decade award from the Industrial Designers Society of America. In California and New York, in the advertising world, and in Silicon Valley, it became a kind of cult object that matched the stripped-down aesthetic of the new economy. It began to appear in films and televised Scion commercials, and from there its profile built and grew and blossomed. By the end of the 1990s, sales were growing 50 to 70% annually, and the people at Herman Miller suddenly realized that what they had on their hands was the best-selling chair in the history of the before long. There was no office chair as widely imitated as the Aeron. Everyone wanted to make a chair that looked like the exoskeleton of a giant prehistoric insect. And what are the aesthetic scores today? The Aeron is now an 8. What once was ugly has become beautiful. Company. In the case of a blind sick test, first impressions don't work because colas aren't supposed to be sick blind. Applying the wrong context for thin slicing. Coke with the Aeron. The effort to collect consumers' first impressions failed for a slightly different reason. The people reporting their first impressions misinterpreted their own feelings. They said they hated it, but what they really meant was that the chair was so new and unusual that they weren't used to it. This isn't true of everything we call ugly. The Edsel, the Ford Motor Company's famous flop from the 1950s, failed because people thought it looked funny. But 2 or 3 years later, every other car maker did suddenly start making cars that looked like the Edsel. The way everyone started copying the Aeron, the Edsel started out ugly, and it's still ugly. By the same token, there are movies that people hate when they see them for the first time, and they still hate them 2 or 3 years later. A bad movie is always a bad movie. The problem is that buried among the things that we hate is a class of products that are in that category only because they are weird. They make us nervous. They are sufficiently different that it takes us some time to understand that we actually like them. When you're in the product development world, you become immersed in your own stuff, and it's hard to keep in mind the fact that the customers you go out and see spend very little time with your products as Dollar. They know the experience of it then and there, but they don't have any history with it, and it's hard for them to imagine a future with it, especially if it's something very different. That was the thing with the Aeron chair. Office chairs in people's minds had a certain aesthetic. They were cushioned and upholstered. The Aeron chair, of course, isn't. It looked different. There was thus nothing familiar. Maybe the word ugly was just a proxy. For different, the problem with market research is that often simply too blunt an instrument to pick up this distinction between the bad and the merely different. In the LAC on sitcom pilot for a show called All in the Family. The WA 1960s, the screenwriter Norman Lear produced a telling a radical departure from the kind of fairly on color Scion. It was edgy and political, and it tackled social issues that the television of the day avoided. Lear took it to ABC. They had it market tested before 400 carefully selected viewers at a theater in Hollywood. Viewers filled out questionnaires and turned to dial marked very dull, fair, good, and very good as they watched the show. With the responses that translated into a score between 1 and 100. For a drama, a good score was 1 in the high 60s. For a comedy, the mid-70s. All in the Family scored in the low 40 seconds. ABC said no. Lear took the show to CBS. They ran it through their own market research protocol called the Program Analyzer, which required audiences to push red and green buttons, recording their impressions of the shows they were watching. The results were unimpressive. The recommendation of the research department was that Archie Bunker be rewritten as a soft-spoken and nurturing father. CBS didn't even bother promoting All in the Family before its first season. What was the point? The only reason it made it to the air at all was that the president of the company, Robert Wood, and the head of programming, Fred Silverman, happened to like it. And the P was so dominant at that point that it failed to take a risk on the show. That same year, CBS was also considering a new comedy show starring Mary Tyler Moore. It, too, was a departure for television. The main character, Mary Richards, was a young single woman who was interested not in starting a family as practically every previous television heroine had been, but in advancing her career. CBS ran the first show through the Program Analyzer. The results were devastating. Mary was a loser.
Her neighbor, Rhoda Morgenstern, was too abrasive, and another of the major female characters on the show, Phyllis Lindstrom, was seen as not believable. The only reason the Mary Tyler Moore Show survived was that by the time CBS tested it, it was already scheduled for broadcast. Had the MTN been a mere pilot, such overwhelmingly negative comments would have buried it. Sally Bedell writes in her biography of Silverman, Up the Tube, All in the Family and the Mary Tyler Moore Show, in other words, were the television equivalents of the Air on Chair. Viewers said they hated them. But, as quickly became clear when these sitcoms became two of the most successful programs in television history, viewers didn't actually hate them. They were just shocked by them. And all of the ballyhoo techniques used by the armies of market researchers at CBS utterly failed to distinguish between these two very different emotions. Market research isn't always wrong, of course. If All in the Family had been more traditional, and if the Air On had been just a minor variation on the chair that came before it, the act of measuring consumer reactions would not have been nearly as difficult. But testing products or ideas that are truly revolutionary is another matter, that in those cases the first impressions of their COU need interpretation. We like market research, Becca. The most successful companies provide certainty. I score, A are those that undie prediction. If us, why we made the decision we did. Someone we can point number. But the truth is that for the most important scions, there can be no certainty. Kenna did badly when he was subjected to market research. But so what? His M was new and different, and it is the new and different TH is always most vulnerable to market research. 5. The gift of expertise. One bright summer day, I had lunch with two Wong who run a company in New Jersey called Sensory Spectrum. Their names are Gail Van Seville and Judy Haymo, and they taste food for a living. If Frito-Lay, for example, has a new kind of tortilla chip, they need to know where their chip prototype fits into the tortilla chip pantheon. How much of a departure is it from their other Doritos varieties? How does it compare to Cape Cod tortilla chips? Do they need to add, say, a bit more salt? Seville and Haleman are the people they send their chips to. Having lunch with professional food tasters, of course, is a tricky proposition. After much thought, I decided on a restaurant called La Madre in downtown Manhattan, which is the kind of place where it takes 5 minutes to recite the list of daily specials. When I arrived, Haleman and Seville were seated, two stylish professional women in business suits. They had already spoken with the waiter. Seville told me the specials were hungry. A great deal of thought obviously went into the lunch choices. Haleman settled on pasta preceded by roasted pumpkin chowder with a sprinkling of celery and onion, finished with creme fraiche and bacon braised cranberry beans garnished with diced pumpkin, fried sage, and toasted pumpkin seeds. Seville had a salad, followed by risotto with Prince Edward Island mussels and vanilla clams, and finished with squid. After we ordered, the waiter left him with a spoonful of soup. Seville held out her hand for another.
We share everything, she informed him. You should see us when we go out with a group of sensory people, Haleman said. We take our bread plates and pass them around. What you get back is half your meal and a little bit of everyone else's. The soup came. The two of them dug in. Oh, it's fabulous, Seville said and cast her eyes heavenward. She handed me her spoon. Taste it. Haleman and Seville both ate with small, quick bites, and as they ate, they talked, interrupting each other like old friends, jumping from topic to topic. They were very funny and talked very quickly. But the talking didn't while the eating. It was true, they seemed to talk only to heighten their anticipation of the next bite, and when the next bite came, their faces took on a look of utter absorption. Haleman and Seville don't just taste food. They the opposite, Kenna's dilemma. Dropping in on bite food. Their dreams about food with doses as Nike going cello. Shopping with the Jane was so rare. My husband says that Giorgio Armani when Monding likes Tans when it's so Coville Sad drives one of my family crazy. Stop talking about it, why? That scene is the Dells from the movie When Harry Sally. That's what I feel about food when I say pick the waiter came offering dessert, creme brulee and chocolate sorbet, or strawberry saffron and bubbly corn vanilla gelato. Haleman had the vanilla gelato and the mango sorbet, but not before she thought hard about creme brulee. Creme brulee is the test of any restaurant, she said. It comes down to the quality of the vanilla. Don't like my creme brulee adulterated, because then you can't taste through to the quality of the ingredients. Espresso came for Sybil. As she took her first sip, an almost imperceptible wince crossed her face. It's good, not great, she said. It's missing the whole limey texture. It a little too woody. Haleman then started talking about rework, which is the practice in some food factories of recycling leftover or rejected ingredients from one product batch into another product batch. Give me some cookies and crackers, she said, and I can tell you not only what factory they came from, but what rework they were using. Seville jumped in. Just the previous night, she said, she had eaten more cookies. And here she named two prominent brands. I could use the rework, she said, and made another face. We've spent years and years developing these skills, she went on. 10 of the years. It's like medical training. You do your internship and then you become a resident, and you do it until you can look at something and say in a very objective way how sweet it is, how bitter it is, how caramelized it is, how much citrus character there is, and in terms of the citrus, this much lemon, this much lime, this much grapefruit, this much orange. Haleman and Seville, in other words, are experts. Would they get fooled by the Pepsi challenge? Of course not, nor would they be led astray by the packaging for Christian Brothers, or be as easily confused by the difference between something they truly don't like and something they simply find unusual. The gift of their expertise is that it allows them to have a much better understanding of what goes on behind the locked door of their unconscious. This is the last and most important lesson of the Kenna story, because it explains why it was such a mistake to favor the results of Kenna's market research so heavily over the enthusiastic reactions of the industry insiders, the crowded, although that is the Roxy, and the viewers of MTV2. The first impressions of experts are different. By that I don't mean that experts like different things than the rest of us. Undeniable. When we become expert in something, our tastes grow more esoteric and complex. What I mean is that it is really only experts who are able to reliably account for their reactions. Jonathan Schooler, whom I introduced in the previous chapter, once did an experiment with Tim Peebles, and that beautifully illustrates this difference. It involved strawberry jam. Consumer Reports put together a panel, Kinna's Dilemma, very specific of food experts, and had them rank 44 brands of strawberry jam from top to bottom in measures of texture and taste. W. Schooler took the 1st, 11th, 24th, 2nd, and 44th ranking jams No Farm, Alpha Beta, Featherweight, Acme, and Ridge, and gave them to a group of College S. Their question was, how close would the student scenes come to the experts? The answer is, pretty close. Students put Knott's Berry Farm 2nd, and Alpha 1st. The XB and the students both agreed that Featherweight W were 3. And, like the Acme and Sorrel Ridge, were experts other way around.